Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You can see more of us joining in our virtual room. This is the webinar from Iran to Korea, Diplomacy, Defiance, and U.S. Lawlessness. Thank you so much for being here. If you'd like to, please introduce yourself in the chat, maybe your name, where you're from, an organization who you're with, if there's a specific thing you're excited to hear about today, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes as we wait for more of us to join. Okay, I think the chat was not working, but it should be working now, so we could roll in with the introductions. I'm Nino. I'll be moderating today, and I'm with Nodotor. We have SoCal, Chicago, Montreal, New York. Amazing. Minneapolis. Okay, yes, let's keep them coming. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This is the webinar from Iran to Korea, Diplomacy, Defiance, and U.S. Lawlessness. It's so great to be having this conversation with our speakers today. This is going to be a 90-minute webinar. We're going to first hear from Bikram Gill, then Simone Chun, then Basma, and then Jihyun Park. After they kind of share their remarks, we are going to open it up for Q&A. There is a question and answer feature in the Zoom below. So if you, throughout the webinar, kind of send in your questions, we'll make sure that any shared ones are read aloud. So any and all questions, whether it comes to analysis or strategy or, movement building, let's all kind of like really be thinking through some of these kind of urgent conversations together. We're going to get started. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. And this is also going to be recorded so you can return to it later or send it to people that you know who are interested in thinking through some of these questions. Um, okay, let's begin. I'm Nino. I'm moderating today. I'm from Dodotor. And, we're joining at a time where the war on Iran has unleashed a global crisis that's decades really in the making. And as the US and Israel commit fresh atrocities across Iran, Lebanon, and Palestine, the oil shock generated by the war is also creating a massive upheaval in the US-led alliance system. The effects of this upheaval are highly visible on the Korean peninsula, where the US has refused to sign a peace agreement to end the Korean War since 1953. Washington's current erratic and volatile behavior is testing its alliance with South Korea, while also raising further doubts as to whether a diplomatic solution to the Korean War can be achieved. The current South Korean president, Lee Jae Myung, has also recently publicly criticized Israel, and that's a sign of the growing fragility of this US alliance system. So we're all here together to really think through the questions of what are the implications of US-Israeli war on Iran for peace and national liberation on the peninsula and around the world? How can social movements form and forge meaningful and lasting bonds of solidarity with other nations targeted by these imperialist wars? We're going to first hear from Dr. Bikram Gill. Um, Dr. Bikram Gill is a scholar of international political economy and a lecturer in the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University. He's the author of the book Political Ecology of Colonial Capitalism, Race, Nature, and Accumulation, that's published by Manchester University Press. Over to you.
Thank you, Nino. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm eager to learn more about how what's been happening in West Asia might have bearing on other regions in the world system, particularly, of course, the Korean Peninsula. So I'm just going to maybe focus more on U.S. imperialism more broadly as it applies to the aggression that has been waged against the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I'm just going to begin by maybe pointing that there are two interrelated scales at which we can understand the war of aggression. In the first instance, this is not a war that has been launched against the Islamic Republic of Iran that we should understand as displacing or eclipsing attention from the genocide in Gaza. This war is a continuation of the two logics of war we witnessed in Gaza. So we have to remember, and this is where I have a little bit of a disagreement with that slogan, not a conflict, not a war. There are two wars in Gaza. There's a genocidal war, but there's a liberation war. And we see both of these wars being extended in Iran. So we have to understand Iran is being attacked because of the support it offers Palestine and the objective of disarming the Palestinians, of forcing the Palestinians to surrender and lay down arms, of forcing the Lebanese resistance to surrender and lay down arms, is a key imperative of why they're striking Iran. An attempt to isolate and further fragment the axis of resistance in West Asia. So that's one level at which we can understand this war. It's a continuation of what we've seen in Gaza. And therefore, the response should be informed by that. Now, there's a second level, it's interrelated, is that the war in Iran, however, has escalated what we've seen in Gaza. Now, we've gone out of the territory of simply an anti-colonial war, and we're firmly now into the arena of an imperialist, anti-imperialist war. This is not to say imperialism, anti-imperialism was not present as a structuring dynamic in Gaza, but it has now become clearly the primary question and dynamic as we see the war in Iran unfold. So it has assumed greater prominence. It's clarified itself as the primary question. And with the war now assuming this scale of imperialism, anti-imperialism, its connections with other regions across the capitalist world system are becoming more clear and necessary to engage. So to understand this distinction between these two levels, like, you know, the way in which the war in Gaza unfolded, the genocidal war, how it's now continued in Iran and escalated to another scale, we have to understand the distinction between colonialism and imperialism. And I don't have much time. I know we're supposed to keep to 10 minutes, so I'm not going to break that down in too much detail. But just so we're on the same page here, it's just important to remember that when we think about colonialism, we are thinking about a denial of sovereignty through military and economic force on a territorial basis. Okay, so you're thinking on territorially, whereas when we're thinking about imperialism, we're extending beyond territory and we're going to the level of the world system, and we're thinking about the flow of capital between territories, the flow of core resources between territories. So when we see now the scale of the fight become something over the Strait of Hormuz, or who controls the exit and entry of oil and capital into and out of West Asia and into and out of the rest of the world, that becomes a question of imperialism, not just colonialism. And what we're seeing is Iran is now actually, the slogan that movements were saying, the costs of the genocide in Gaza must be borne by the world. Well, now the Strait of Hormuz is bringing that truth to bear on the world, right? That like now we're seeing an anti-imperialist force that is insisting on backstopping a different type of legal order that can really oppose, say, a genocidal logic. Okay, so how do we understand U.S. imperialism? So I'm just going to maybe provide a little background here before I come back to the war on this, like the significance of this war in terms of understanding it, in terms of that logic I just said, imperialism versus anti-imperialism. So it's interesting, the topic of the webinar here, thinking like, say, the war against Iran in relation to the Korean Peninsula in particular, you know, U.S. imperialism really comes into its own. It really manifests itself and emerges vis-a-vis Iran and Korea historically, right? You have the Korean War and Operation Ajax, the coup d'etat that overthrows the Mossadegh government, is the two kind of initial shots of U.S. imperialism in the 1950s. And I think both will help us understand the structure of U.S. imperialism. And thinking a little bit about how they were interrelated then and maybe what it means for us today, like the U.S. imperialism in the post-World War II era, um, there's an immediate challenge it confronts, right? Which is what U.S. policymakers call the loss of China after World War II, is that the communist revolution comes, and now you have a loss of China, which is a loss of markets, which is a loss of resources, which now is a major bulwark against capitalism and imperialism in Asia. So this is going to have implications for how capitalism in the core can stabilize itself if it loses such a massive surplus value drain as China represented. And this is in very significant ways informing the Korean War and the United States invasion of Korea and desire to subjugate Korea, because the Korean liberation movement also puts on the table what the Chinese movement put on: land reform, nationalization, which was essentially sovereignty over resources. This is the key question of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism: reassertion of sovereignty, so that the value you generate from your resources and labor is recycled back into your territory. It's not exported to serve the accumulation and development imperatives of abroad. So this informs the aggression, the violent, even genocidal military aggression that is waged against Korea in the early 1950s. And the Korean War, though, exhausts the US military capabilities. So as the Korean War is winding down and enters into this quote unquote stalemate, but which will be an ongoing aggression, particularly against North Korea, but a capturing also of the sovereignty of the South, we see the United States then switch focus to West Asia, and they want to build a collective defense architecture in West Asia to prevent another Korea, to prevent another China. But they cannot engage in another military aggression because of how they've been exhausted in Korea. So they launch a coup d'etat against the Mossadegh government in 1953. And why do they do so? Because fundamental to US imperialism is exercising control over the flow of capital. They don't need to own the oil, the flow of oil, sorry. They don't need to own the oil in West Asia, but to control the flow of oil into and out of the region. And of course, we know that the Mossadegh government had sought to nationalize oil in Iran in the early 1950s. And an important part of the story that links explicitly to what's happening today, when Mossadegh nationalizes oil in Iran in 1951, the British respond because, they nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The British respond by imposing a blockade on Iran that is very similar to what the United States is imposing today outside the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States tries to negotiate with the Mossadegh government, but it's a very similar negotiation to what we're seeing today, where they're essentially using the blockade in the 1952, 1953 to try to impose an Iranian surrender, to say, okay, we recognize that you have nationalized your oil, but they try to impose terms that are very unfavorable to Iran, which effectively would re-empower the British oil firm to continue draining value from Iran. So, there's a long history of US imperialism in both regions, but what it's seeking to establish is sovereign power over the flow of resources across the world system. And this is why they overthrow the Mossadegh government. Okay, so I know I'm running a little short on time, so I'm just going to go a little faster now, and maybe can come back to it in the discussion. So I think what's important though is the United States overthrows the Mossadegh government. Maybe a small point that's relevant, also maybe worth mentioning. Mossadegh withdraws recognition of Israel, of the Zionist state, which is another, I think, motivating factor for the overthrow of Mossadegh. Now, of course, 25 years later, this is going to motivate the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Okay, it's going to rise up to challenge the repressive state that the United States put in power in Iran and it backed under the Shah. This is a revolution that comes to challenge the military and economic basis of the United States in the region. And this is what becomes unforgivable about the state of Iran today, is that the revolution in 1979 challenges the basis of US imperialism. It challenges its military and its economic basis. It reasserts sovereign control over both oil wealth and the flow of oil and the recycling of oil revenues. And it does so also by establishing a form of military sovereignty and the export of that type of military sovereignty to other resistance organizations in the region, from Lebanon to Palestine to Yemen and so forth, right? And that has been the history of the last 47 years. The role that the Islamic Republic has played is that it's provisioned really indispensable military support, in particular to resistance regions, organizations across the world. I mean, across the West Asian region in particular, right? And there's a story to be told there too. We can come to it in the discussion. Is that North Korea actually played a really central role to the consolidation of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic in the 1980s. It does provision Iran with very essential both arms transfers, but also knowledge diffusion for how to construct the missile program that we can see has been essential to defending Iranian sovereignty today. And so, I think the significance of the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic from 1979 to today is that it has challenged the imperialist order in West Asia. It has reasserted sovereign control over resources, and it has spread the armed capacity with which other groups in the region could challenge the hard power with which imperialism imposes itself on the region. And this is why Iran has been subject to sanctions and war repeatedly over the past 47 years, nonstop, right? If Iran was to abandon the Palestinian resistance, if it was to abandon the Lebanese resistance, if it was to abandon the Yemeni resistance, Iran would be immediately welcomed into the U.S.-led order, right? But it refuses to do so, and this is why it has been subject to this war of the past 40 days, right? It's like I think the point where I started my comments is that I think the motivating force of this war is to force Iran to abandon its support for these what they call proxies, but which are really national liberation movements, right? And Iran has been a key source of strategic depth. Is to demand Iran itself disarm. Okay, what they want to reduce Iran to is the equivalent of South Korea. They want to reduce Iran to the equivalent of, say, what South Africa was after apartheid, the equivalent of the West Bank, the equivalent of all of these client type of regimes that are not really sovereign. In order to do so, so they can resecure the basis of imperialism in the region. But what I will conclude with is what we've witnessed is that imperialism has failed dramatically over the past 40 days. We've seen a world historic failure in its aggression against Iran. Just like in Palestine and Lebanon, okay, for however much damage that they have done, however much genocidal destruction and death that they have visited, they have not imposed surrender on the Palestinians or the Lebanese resistance. They have not achieved their aims of disarming them, and neither did they do so in this war against Iran. Iran, in fact, has replenished its arsenal, has fired back at a rate that nobody expected, right? So, and Iran has now escalated, like I was saying, to that level of anti-imperialism. Not only did it withstand the aggression, okay, Iran has withstood the aggression and it has now seized control, not seized control, it has asserted what is its rightful sovereign power over the Strait of Hormuz. And so now it's escalated. It's achieved an escalation dominance with which now it can say the death and destruction that imperialism and Zionism and colonialism impose on the West Asian region in order to maintain that monopoly power over the flow of oil. In order to, Iran has now demonstrated that those costs will not be borne by the people of West Asia alone. Iran is demonstrating that you cannot now bombard the region to maintain your oil interests, to maintain the petrodollar equation that is pivotal to US imperialism, that the Strait of Hormuz now shows the truth of the underlying power that Iran has established. And the costs of US imperialist aggression will now be distributed across the world, and the whole world economy will have to bear the costs, not just the people of West Asia. So this is a world historic transformation, I think, that is now fracturing US alliances. While they came to break Iran and break the West Asian region and fracture the unity of fronts of the Axis, in fact, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a reversal where now US alliances are fracturing and creaking. And so I think we have a very historic moment upon us that we haven't quite encountered before. So I'll stop there and look forward to coming back to it in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Bikram. You've given us so much to think about. I mean, your historicizing U.S. intervention in Iran, but also highlighting the economic and material basis of what's driving U.S. imperialist aggression today. And most importantly, this imperialist project is failing, and the political stakes of those who are defending and asserting national sovereignty are so high. So, really appreciate that. Um, we're next going to introduce Dr. Simone Chun. She is a researcher and activist specializing in inter-Korean relations and U.S. foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula. She serves on the board of directors of the Korea Policy Institute and the advisory board of Code Pink.
Do you see my screen, the slide?
Yes.
You see the slide?
Yes. Is it possible to make it a bit bigger?
Yeah. Is it better? How do you know? You see the
Perfect.
full, you see the full screen, full slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And I'll be presenting Tehran to Road to Seoul Street, Building Peace Beyond U.S. Israeli war politics. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly outline the roadmap for today's presentation. We'll start by grounding our discussion in international solidarity and structural war systems, then move into the geopolitical context of U.S. alliance pressure and Korean sovereignty. From there, we'll examine civil society resistance and public mobilization in South Korea, followed by a closer look at policy debates, humanitarian impacts, and economic consequences of global conflict. Finally, we'll conclude with the reflections on ethics-driven sovereignty and the role of civil society in shaping peace-oriented futures. To begin with, the title itself carries both symbolic and historical meanings. Tehran Row is actually an actual major street in Seoul's Gangnam Street. You might recall the famous K-pop, Oppan Gangnam Style. Named in the late 1970s during a period of diplomatic and economic exchange between South Korea and Iran. Similar gestures to the connection have also appeared in Tehran, reflecting moment when these societies sought cooperation rather than separation. This reminds us global politics is not only shaped in capitals or international summits, but is also embedded in everyday spaces, streets, cities, historical memory. In this sense, the title connects Seoul and Tehran as a way of grounding today's discussion in lived realities, where questions of war, peace, and responsibility are already present in daily life. With that framing in mind, we now move to our first section, which examines how war operates not only as geopolitics, but as a structural system tied to economics, labor, and global inequality. We begin by reframing war as a structural system sustained by military-industrial networks and global inequality. Rather than isolated conflicts, war is embedded in the supply chain, finance, and labor systems that generate profit for some while imposing inflation, insecurity, and austerity on ordinary people. In this context, we shift from symbolic protest toward material solidarity, coordinated transnational action involving workers, civil society, and communities affected by militarization. Peace, therefore, is not simply moral aspiration, but structural transformation. Therefore, national liberation, let's suppose Korea's national liberation, cannot be separated from global systems of militarism and capital. And lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula depends not only on inter-Korean relations, but on transforming global conditions that produces war. Building on this framework, we now turn to the geopolitical structure shaping Korea's position. As historian Bruce Cummings explains, U.S. containment strategy operates through both external pressure and internal discipline of allies. This means South US-South Korea relations are not fully symmetrical. Instead, they are shaped by strategic dependency, military integration, and political pressure, limiting full sovereign autonomy and setting the stage for ongoing tensions. I want to highlight some of the even most recent pressures, such as US tariff threats, pressure to deploy Korean troops to the Middle East, opposition to the peaceful use of the demilitarized zone, pressure on unification minister who are pursuing very sovereignty-oriented policy, and Trump's the latest ambassadorial nominee, who is very far-right, anti-China, anti-North Korea. And all these reflect continuity of the US pressure approach. Therefore, President Lee Jae Myung's recent criticism of Israel's human rights record, as well as South Korea's broad popular mandate for sovereignty and strong approval ratings for Lee, must be understood within this context of sustained US pressure and encroachment of South Korea's sovereignty. This is just showing the what's happening right now. Just the news that my friends shared just this morning. U.S. FA commander warns against the political expediency in rushed Afghan transfer, despite the fact that President Lee Jae Myung supports it, and he wants President Lee Jae Myung expedite the reclaiming the Afghan transfer. In other words, U.S. FK commander directly challenging, pressuring South Korean Democratic elected president. And another one is that this is the latest the appointment of U.S. ambassador, who will be soon confirmed in the Senate, and who's known for very far-right, anti-North Korea, anti-China candidate. And all this to show that how U.S. pressure, how U.S. treat its allies. And this brings us to the how the society, Korean civil society reacts. Against this spectrum, we see in Korea the sustained civil society response across Korea. Candlelight vigils have become a recurring form of democratic expression. As you know, these are not isolated. Those of you who know Korean, read the who's behind it. This movement has just in fact beginning, and you have Korean civil society not only in Korea but also Germany, France, of course, certain United States here. And so this is ongoing collective actions involving labor groups, students, religious organizations, civic activities, and their message is very consistent: oppose war, escalation, and defend national sovereignty and foreign policy decisions. And in this context, President Lee Jae Myung, as you all know, has recently made a very common sense criticism of Israel's human rights violation. This quoting here, he said, it would be worth reflecting at least once, we're talking about Israel, on the criticism from people around the world who are suffering and struggling due to these relentless actions that violate human rights and international law. Instead, he's obviously this is disappointing how disappointing Israelis' human rights violations are, and the inability to take accountability seriously. And he's talking about in Korean, the inji something. This is a little bit hard to translate in English, but it means that it's a very common sense, human nature. If I'm in pain, others also feel the same pain. It is human nature to feel remorse, empathy, and sympathy when someone else suffers as a result of the harm one has caused. As you can see, that this is a very common sense, almost universal norms, which Israel is not respecting. And so let's take a look at the war's implications for the peace and national liberation of the Korean peninsula. Despite President Lee Jae Myung's obviously a clear, somewhat a blunt shift towards criticism of Israel, Korea faces enormous pressure from the United States war strategy that is deepening militarization and dependence at the expense of its sovereignty, as we already have mentioned. So let me take a look at these somewhat human faces as you and all of us are faced with every day about this continuing, the cost of human cost of this continuing genocide and the war. This morning, it was last night actually, I just read the story of Matan, who's a 7-year-old Iranian boy who was, as you know, was killed, was one of the 171 children killed by the Israeli and US missiles. And this was actually, I would not have known the story, but it was posted by Korean peace activists on his Facebook. So I read the story, and they could not. The only thing that his parents could find was in the school. It was this horrific scene, as you could imagine. It's only his shoe, right, shoe, and it shows that war is not just as abstract, especially when you look at your children. It's really mine. It just could be, my nephews, my niece, and in fact, the student, my students that I teach, that I taught this today in school. So this is why this war is not about just against Iranians. This war is not just Palestinians. It's someday, if we don't stop here, it's going to be harm to us. And Korea, in addition to in Korea's President Lee Jae Myung has been now shifting on more human rights and a direct criticism of Israel's human rights violation. They also now deciding, as part of diplomacy with Iran, they has decided to provide the humanitarian aid, which doesn't look like a lot, but still I think it shows that it's a gesture that goes along with the policy. This is showing more about the humanitarian consequences of the Korean War. This is about how, as you know, since World War II, 9% of the casualties, victims of the war, any wars, are civilians, and especially women and children are the biggest victims of the war. So going back to the President Lee's sovereign diplomacy. And this is it is an important shift, but I think that needs more aggressive and more consistent, a real policy action. For instance, South Korea has to review its arms export and also about other areas of engagement, and which has to be also anti-war solidarity has to be also in conjunction with the regional stability and global effort. This is showing that how Lee Jae Myung used social media, in other words, to address the broader population and international audience to address this humanitarian issues. And he did not really, usually Korean president, first of all, it will be, it's very unusual for Korean president to criticize Israel, but also not only did he criticize, he actually defended his criticism. He did not retract. So here, that being said, though, President Lee Jae Myung's criticism of Israel's human rights record is understood within these three principles: human rights, and also national interest, and also realistic economic reliance on the Middle East. And that still, as I pointed out, that South Korea operates within a clearly U.S.-centered alliance system, and therefore will continue to maintain pragmatic ties with Israel, and also structurally connected to U.S. and Israeli geopolitical actions. So overall, Lee Jae Myung's criticism was a positive step, but however, it is just the balancing it under enormous constraint. What's most interesting about it is how Korean public responds to President Lee Jae Myung's stance on international human rights and its criticism of Israel. As you know, this is the latest polling shows that 60% of approval rating. This is an incredible amount of support, which shows that public also supports the president's policy stance on international the Korean War, and also president's criticism of human rights violation. Another area that probably we also wanted to talk about is that why is that human rights cannot be only understood and analyzed within on human rights regime, because there's also concrete stress. There's a crisis, especially as far as Korea is concerned. For instance, if war prolongs, it's going to have a devastating impact. And as you can see the article. And therefore, President also included the proposed emergency budget, which I will show you important step. And interestingly, that remark, the president's criticism of human rights, Israel's human rights violation, was politically also motivated as well. As it turned out that it really helped Korea's diplomacy with Iran. as you can see, the first oil tanker in rigs were passed. And this was also part of which might also suggest that why the president made that decision as well. So in other words, showing that President Lee Jae Myung's human rights stand is not just purely just moral imperative, but it was also he was obviously having a national interest in mind. And this is shown, in other words, going back to the economic issues, this I said it's about the Korea's economic conditions affecting Korea, but it could be any country, any countries in the world right now. And the consumers and workers and ordinary people, you and I, are all affected by this crisis. And also, it was a disproportionately affect the people, working poor, working class, and which is important because of what it is a common condition that we all affected, and that is also should be source for international solidarity. The workers in Gaza, workers in Iran. I heard that more than now 60% of them Iranians are going to be basically unemployed if they still survive. So what we're looking at is the predatory imperialism that is about the more Middle East conflict. It cannot be only analyzed within national, like even human rights issues. It is basically talking about global capitalism that is part of the engine of this war.
So to give us your concluding remarks, and we can continue.
Okay, let me conclude remark, and then maybe I will, as a way of concluding, let me just say that in response, Koreans as that immediate mobilization, 661 Korean organizations, they are against war, and as a concluding remark, I will just show you some of these images of how Koreans are mobilized, and these are all about images of Koreans who are against war, who's immediately mobilized more faster than any other country in the world, and continuing now expanding, and now which actually I think the main point that I wanted to point out is that President Lee's shift is specifically in response to these popular mobilization and activism, and I think that which I argue is hope, not only hope for Korea, but also hope for the rest of the world. And also, I want to say one last thing. As you can see, this lady who's on the left, who's saying that she said, "Don't kill children," and she said that Korean teachers solidarity with the Palestinians. And thank you.
Very powerful note to end on. That hope is really about the people and generated by people who create the conditions for it, right? Thank you so much, Simone. Your note that peace is not just a moral fight or one that's only understood through a human rights frame, but that it's around deeply structural and political issues is so important, and that the Korean national liberation fight must be won by transforming both geopolitical and global conditions of capitalism and imperialism. So thank you. Next, I'm going to introduce Basma. Basma is an organizer and popular educator with the Palestinian Youth Movement. And I encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature to get your questions in, as we will soon be bringing all of our panelists in to have a discussion. Over to you, Basma.
Thank you. I wanted to quickly ask, are the slides working, or should I try to share them from my end? Perfect. Thank you, Winter. I want to start by saying thank you so much to Nodutol for bringing us together, because as the previous panelists have shared, this is a war that is really global, right? Like the impacts go beyond the region, go beyond Palestine, beyond Iran, beyond Lebanon, because it is an anti-imperialist struggle. So when I was brought the question of like, how is this war impacting the Palestinian struggle, I realized that it was a really broad question, because it's impacting so many people and so much around world power and world imperialism. So I wanted to start by saying that like the way I'm going to structure responding to this is going to be super brief and touching on very like surface level on a lot of different things, but happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. But it's really going to start by talking about Iran's sovereignty and its fight to maintain its sovereignty, which goes back to what Bikram was saying, right? Like this is an anti-imperialist war and it's a resistance to imperialism. And therefore, this is the core of it, is the maintenance of sovereignty. I will also talk about Israel's expansionist dreams into Gaza, into Lebanon, into the rest of Palestine, and further into the region, and what that encompasses in terms of the question of sovereignty for Palestine and Lebanon as well. And then tie it back to really like the struggle for liberation in Palestine and in Lebanon, since these are the places most impacted at the moment. So if we could go to the next slide. I wanted to start by highlighting two areas in which Iran is really fighting for sovereignty. The first is on the economic front against imperialism, and the second is militaristically. As both of the panelists have spoken, this war has been felt across the world. It's not just happening in the Middle East in a certain place, but really expanding across the planet. And it is because of the ways that Iran has been targeting the economic leg of imperialism and making sure that it is upholding economic leverage over the United States. And what that has done is created a condition where the United States is no longer able to play the role of the stable superpower that the world can rely on. Because what it is showing is that actually, as the United States is going to war against Iran, it is impacting itself, it's impacting its allies, and it's impacting the entire world because of the ways that Iran is leveraging the Strait of Hormuz. And we're seeing this shift in world power because China has been able to use this war as a way to impose multipolarity in the conditions of world imperialism. And we see that because suddenly there is a competing force for stability against the United States, and that is China. And we see that with the shifts of the United States allies starting to turn towards China as a stable superpower in comparison to solely relying on the US. And that has been really important because the contradictions are also being heightened militaristically when the US has all of these military bases in the region and Iran is bombing them. And what that shows is that the US is not even able to provide protection to its allies because as long as they are supporters of the United States, they are being subject to bombardment. And that has created massive contradictions within the Arab world and the Arabian Gulf states, but also to all US allies who are now starting to see, like we're seeing NATO being hesitant to participate because that subjects them to being impacted militaristically and not just economically in this war. So to sum that up, it's really what we see is Iran fighting for its sovereignty. It has become an existential war for Iran. It is no longer, like Bikram was saying, just a fight against an occupier or colonialism, but imperialism as a whole. Because we are seeing that Iran is saying, I will not abandon the resistance that we have seen in the region, that is enacting sovereignty through a national liberation struggle, but also refusing to abandon its own sovereignty by targeting imperialism in all of the facets. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we're seeing simultaneously happen is Zionist expansionism and genocide also bridging further and further away from just Gaza, from what we've seen for the past few years. We know that since the inception of Zionism by Theodor Herzl, he had dreamt of greater Israel that expands way beyond the borders of Palestine. And what we see is that actually, like in the outcomes of the genocide in Gaza and what is currently an ongoing attack on Lebanon, that has been there since the inception of Zionism, right? And but if we focus on these past few years, creating this perception of the yellow line on the southern border of Lebanon and on the borders of Gaza to attempt to accumulate more land, and creates thus also an existential crisis for Palestine and Lebanon that has been since the inception of Zionism, but also is becoming further emphasized over the course of these past few years, and particularly through this war. So we see that Gaza is being continuously bombarded, the starvation is ongoing, the genocide perpetuates with the refusal of opening the borders to allow aid. We see that the Zionist entity is now also occupying more and more land within the West Bank, building more settlements, now also on the border of Gaza, into southern Lebanon, further in the West Bank. And what we're seeing is that it's also leading to further Palestinian death in other ways, such as the genocide behind bars against Palestinian prisoners who are facing some of the most atrocious and brutal conditions of starvation and of torture, but also in the ways that, for example, Israel intercepts missiles from Iran over the West Bank in order to cause the most damage to Palestinian families and Palestinian people. So this war that's happening in Iran is impacting the Palestinian struggle because we're seeing, as also Vikram was saying, this is an extension of what has already been. This is now another massive battle of remaining and of continuation of the people of Palestine, of the people of Lebanon, of the people of Iran, fighting against an attempt at their erasure and an attempt at their succumbing to imperialist ways. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So how is this impacting the Palestinian struggle more locally? So what we're seeing is that Iran's fight for sovereignty is not just for itself, but very much includes Lebanon and Palestine. And this has always been the case, but this war has more than ever proved it to be the case. And we saw that now most recently with the ceasefire negotiations that happened, where Iran was very firm that if Lebanon is not included, they will not continue in those conversations. And we saw imperialism, the US empire, start to be incredibly afraid by this stance, because what that means is that there are people who get to determine their own sovereignty beyond Iran with the support of Iran. And what they did was they went into conversations, attempted negotiations with the Lebanese government, which is a comprador government, a puppet government that went on a path of normalization to attempt to subdue the impact of Iran's stance for sovereignty for Lebanon. And we see that it is fighting for Palestinian sovereignty because Iran is not solely attacking US bases, but continuing to attack the Zionist entity for the violence and brutality that it has caused in the region through being an occupying entity, a settler colony. And through this all, we see that there's actually been resistance to imperialism that has happened continuously in Palestine and Lebanon, but also furthermore in the region where the people, for example, in Kuwait and Bahrain are rising up against and starting to pose questions of why is it that we host so many US bases that are causing us to be subjugated to being attacked in this way. What's important here is that this fight for sovereignty, because it is so deeply existential for Palestine, for Lebanon, for Iran, is continuing to see a resistance of the people. Even as the genocide continues, Gaza resists. Israel has not been able to occupy all of Gaza. They have not been able to push all of the people out of Gaza, despite the atrocious extermination that they have conducted on it. We see the resistance in Lebanon continuing to fight against occupation. Even as Bint Jbeil was surrounded, the resistance was fighting against allowing the Zionists to push further than their so-called yellow line into their dreams of reaching the Litani. And we see that the cost of this war has been tremendous on the lives of the Lebanese, of the Palestinians, of the Iranians, and now on the costs of the lives around the world. But the struggle continues on because this is a pivotal moment in the fight against imperialism that impacts all of us across the planet to finally be able to take a stance against the unipolarity of the United States and to create an avenue of multipolarity that's going to be necessary to be able to be liberated, to be able to have end to occupations and end to settler colonialism, but also most importantly, to be able to be rid of the violence of US empire that has subjugated so many people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basma. Your presentation, I think, just really contextualizes the atrocity of the genocidal war in Palestine and West Asia, but also the shift in the balance of uh, of forces and making really central the incredible resistance and people's uprising and strikes against U.S. imperialism. So thank you for that. Next, we have Juhyun Park, who is a member of Dodotor and a writer. Their work has appeared in The New Inquiry, People's Dispatch, Counterpunch, and other outlets.
Thank you so much, Nino. First of all, thank you as well to all our panelists and to everyone who's attending, both in person and, if you're going to watch later asynchronously as well. I think we've had some really great conversation today about the global sort of historic shift that's taking place before our eyes through this war and the ways that it's already beginning to materialize at the level of the US-South Korea alliance, of course, and in the struggle within the region of West Asia itself. My topic is going to focus on something that many of us are probably wondering, which is how does this affect US DPRK relations or US North Korea relations? I wanted to start with what is now a photo that very much feels like it's from another time. This is Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump at the DMZ, all the way back in 2019, if you can believe it, 7 years ago. And I wanted to start from this moment because I think in the minds of many Americans, we are still here, where people believe that, some kind of diplomatic process still has considerable kind of possibility between Washington and Pyongyang. But the reality is that for the past several years, we have actually been in a diplomatic impasse where both the US and North Korea say that they are open to talks, but no talks have actually taken place. And that leads to the question of why. The answer is that there is a fundamental contradiction in purposes. The US sees the purpose of diplomacy as means to achieve what it cannot achieve through other ways. For 40 years, from the signing of the armistice with the DPRK in 1953 until the early 1990s, the US pretty much diplomatically ignored North Korea. It was the start of North Korea's nuclear program, which actually brought them to the table. And for the US, the purpose has always been very singularly focused on the goal of disarmament. But on the other hand, for North Korea or the DPRK, the goal of diplomacy has been to reduce the threats that are posed by Washington. And these come in the form of US war games in Korea, which take place not only annually, but pretty much on a daily basis on our peninsula. The threats also come in the form of the US occupation of Korea. The US has more than 80 military installations in South Korea and about 28,000 troops at any given time. And finally, there is, of course, US sanctions, which pose a major threat economically to the DPRK and really constitute another form of warfare that the US has used in its long, long struggle to defeat the DPRK and its socialist system. Now, since the 90s, there have been multiple rounds of diplomatic engagement, and through that process, two trends have emerged. First, the US has shown that it will not negotiate in good faith and will actually only accept maximal concessions. And that's something that, of course, we're seeing play out before us in real time vis-a-vis Iran. And second, there has been a trend where the DPRK or North Korea's relative strength, its military capabilities, its economy have actually grown over time, while US power on the world stage has diminished in relative terms. It's done the reverse. And what that means is that the conditions we have right now are very different than what we had before, and therefore, what may have worked before will not necessarily work now. To kind of take us down the pathway of thinking about these different points of diplomatic engagement, I want to talk about the three major episodes that took place. In the 1990s, there was something called the Agreed Framework that was initially signed by the Clinton administration and the DPRK in response to the development of the DPRK's nuclear program, which at that time was entirely civilian. And at this point, the DPRK agreed to shut down its nuclear facilities in exchange for technological support and eventual diplomatic recognition. But there was an understanding in Washington at the time that the US would actually not take this agreement very seriously because the consensus was that the DPRK was going to imminently fall in a manner similar to the Soviet Union. But of course, as we've seen from the historical record, that turned out to not be true. And the following Bush Jr. administration ended up killing this agreement by refusing to honor the terms. And in response, the DPRK left the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in the early 2000s. That triggered the next round of negotiations known as the six-party talks. The six-party talks were multilateral dialogues that were held between 6 different countries, including the US, DPRK, South Korea, Japan, China, and Russia. And once again, during this period, the DPRK agreed to shut down its nuclear facilities in exchange for fuel aid and for diplomatic normalization with the United States and Japan. But the US was not satisfied, and they tried to use the talks to also restrict the DPRK's space program. So after an unsuccessful satellite launch in 2009, the new Obama administration then turned to the UN Security Council to threaten new sanctions on the DPRK, which Pyongyang saw as a violation of the spirit of the talks that were taking place, and then resulted in the six-party talks being killed and all the agreements that had been reached being nullified. And it would be about a decade later until there was another round of engagement with the United States, this time under the first Trump administration. In 2017, the DPRK had a major ballistic missile test that demonstrated its capacity to reach the US. The US responded by, I believe, the specific words that Trump used were to completely destroy the Korean peninsula and to unleash fire and fury upon the Korean people. And that resulted in 2 rounds of summits in Hanoi and in Singapore. Now, unlike before, no agreement actually came out of these summits, but some of the themes did hold. The DPRK actually imposed a moratorium on itself to stop ballistic missile testing and continued to observe this until 2022, even after the possibility of talks had died down. They also reiterated that they would be open to discussing denuclearization and considering these measures. But what ultimately killed these talks was once again US unilateralism and a US maximalist approach. The Trump administration would not reduce sanctions, and that meant the talks could go nowhere. And that's what's led us to where we are today, where we are at a diplomatic impasse, and in fact, the DPRK has changed its terms. I want to take a moment here to highlight 2 very recent articles that came out in Foreign Affairs, which is a very important publication in the world of kind of the US State Department and it's kind of official diplomatic channels in Washington. On the left is an article called North Korea as It Is, The Case for a Cold Peace by Victor Cha, who is associated with the think tank CSIS. If you know anything about recent US-Korea history, you'll know the name Victor Cha because this is one of the primary architects of much of the US strategy concerning the Korean Peninsula. And then on the right is a former CIA officer, actually, Chung Pak, who wrote How North Korea Won. So what we're seeing now is that there is a growing consensus in Washington, actually, that denuclearization is a dead end. There is no possibility to engage the DPRK on the question of diplomacy. And it's not just Noruto saying this, it is now become a mainstream opinion. For many years, we said that any chance at reviving talks would have to emphasize mutual security and de-escalation and could not start from the premise that only one side needed to disarm. And, I think that, pointing these things out helps us understand how much the situation has shifted. And it shows us that even the war hawks are beginning to wake up to reality. That, the approach that the US has taken over the last 30 years has failed. But then that also leaves the question of what happens next. If you ask the war hawks, they'll tell you that, the US should just kind of step down to the next best thing, which is to maintain its foothold in Korea, its military presence, to try to seek other ways to limit the DPRK militarily and keep the focus entirely on maintaining as much US dominance as is possible in the region. This, of course, is not a perspective that accords with any kind of movement that promotes peace or justice in the Korean Peninsula, in the region, or around the world. And so I think when we think about the question of diplomacy today and what it can really achieve, we need to consider these examples from Korean history. And we also need to look at what is happening with Iran and Lebanon today, where the US is using negotiations as a shield to basically coordinate attacks against Iran, to buy time in order to gain advantage on the military battlefield. And so I want to propose three things to kind of guide our thinking. The first is that the US is just fundamentally not a trustworthy actor in diplomacy. The second is that the US is the primary threat to peace in Korea and in our region. And so the focus actually needs to be on US de-escalation and withdrawal. And lastly, that people's movements can change the political options available to governments. We don't have the option as people that live in the US or wherever we are to sit this out because we are living in an incredibly violent time where the US is lashing out precisely because it has less power than ever before. And it is motivated to hold on to whatever it can. And so we can't assume that the US will never start a war in East Asia just because there are nuclear powers there. Every single military analyst said that it would be geopolitical, economically suicidal for the US to attack Iran, and yet they did it anyway. We're not dealing with rational actors. And our response cannot be despair or surrender, but it has to be responsibility. We have to be willing to say that we have a role to play in history, and we need to think about what the concrete things that we can achieve are. And so I want us to consider a few things. The first is that as the war is dragging on, there is an increasing growth in anti-war sentiment in the US that is also paired with opposition to austerity and to the kind of economic crisis that the working class in the US has been essentially dealing with since 2008. And we have May Day coming up, where many organizations, many unions are calling for a one-day general strike of some kind. I think we have to take it upon ourselves to really join in with those movements, to bring the concerns of the Korean Peninsula to them and make them legible. Not only the Korean Peninsula, but really to every site of national liberation, every struggle against imperialism that's currently taking place today. We have to help raise that consciousness to an anti-imperialist level. And the second is that I think we need to really focus on making US war exercises a very well understood part of how the US war machine works. Just last month, we had Freedom Shield in South Korea. Right now, as we speak, the US is conducting the Balikatan exercises in the Philippines. That's the photo on the left. Korea is on the right. And in June, we'll have RIMPAC in Hawaii, which is one of the largest war games anywhere in the world. And these war games don't just destroy land and harm people. They are also a huge part of how the war machine functions economically and politically, because the war games keep demand for weapons high, and they give the false impression that US bases are actually keeping countries safe. But of course, we can just look to the Persian Gulf to understand how correct that really is or not. So we have a duty to make, the war games understood, to help, bring the concerns that people are having in their daily lives to really understanding how it's the same ruling class that is attacking us at the global scale. And I think also we need to oppose the US-South Korea alliance. This is actually a long-standing demand of the progressive movement in South Korea itself. They know that the alliance does not exist for their protection. It's a mechanism for the US to exploit Korea. As a result of this war, we've seen the US take the weapons that it says are there to protect Korean people and actually move them to the front in West Asia for the purpose of prosecuting a war that we all understand to be a crime. And so when it comes to the question of war and peace in Korea, the alliance is a major cause of tension and brinksmanship. And it's time to put an end to it. And that will take solidarity between people's movements in both countries, along with political pressure that we can build internationally. I think we are at time, and I want to make sure that we have, enough left for discussion and for Q&A. But I wanted to just highlight two steps that I wanted to invite everyone who's watching to take today. The first is a recent campaign that was launched by Women Cross DMZ, actually. I think we're going to share the link in the chat. But you may not have heard about this, but the recent National Defense Authorization Act actually included language to try to prevent the Trump administration from reducing its troop presence in South Korea. And these were measures and amendments that were supported by Democrats. And so, our friends at Women Cross DMZ and Korea Peace Now are doing their best to try to apply some of that pressure at the legislative level in order to ensure that there isn't a repetition of this kind of language, and to also demonstrate that, this is not actually something that reflects the will of people in the US or in South Korea. It's entirely something that only benefits these kind of war hawks in Washington. And secondly, I want to invite everyone to join and participate in the US Out of Korea campaign. Come to our events, endorse if you belong to an organization, join our mailing list. You can go to our website and add your email there right away, and then you'll learn about whether we have additional webinars like these or mobilizations, teach-ins, all kinds of things where you can engage and really become part of this wider effort that we're pushing in order to build this political consciousness and a real movement to achieve all the things that we know need to be done.
Wow. Thank you, Chuhyun. That was incredibly clarifying. The failure of US diplomacy really shows us that the current moment demands a shift from disarmament, denuclearization, and that peace is something to be fought for. So thank you. I'm going to invite all the panelists to come back on the screen and just give another note of appreciation for Bikram, for Simone, Basma, and Chuhyun. All of your remarks, I think, just really speak to each other. We have about 20 minutes, and we have a couple questions. So I'm going to invite you all to jump in and even ask each other questions if you'd like. I'm going to read a couple that are shared. Um, and then we can kind of take it away. So we have one around, panelists speaking to um, the importance of how people in the US can support Korean liberation movements, how Dodotor's goals, and if they're currently studying in especially if they're currently studying in South Korea, but also how can the people in the US support liberation movements overall, right? Is one question. And then we have one that is asking for clarification on knowing that the American empire moved its military assets from East Asia, especially the southern part of the Korean peninsula, to West Asia during its war against Iran, and whether this is a chance for Korean reunification.
Um, Probably Julian can also, can I just try answering at least one of those questions? Um, the prospect of reunification in times of war in the Middle East. At this point, I think I would say it's a pretty slim. The you know, despite our all attention on the war in the Middle East, the biggest, I think, the war that is being prepared, in my view, is the war against China. So South Korea is in the basic front line in that context. Um, Therefore, I don't see any immediate any prospect of the reunification, which means that some sort of intercoordinate rapprochement or peaceful reunification, or the other way, it will be more unification through um, uh, force or class struggle. So neither of which looks so realistic. But one thing is, though, there are analysts who think that focus on U.S. Israeli focus on Middle East creates a space for the people working for the peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula. They give us space. So there's that argument. I think there's some merit to that. I kind of forgot the first question, but maybe Julian can um, address that.
I think that's an excellent answer, and I would agree with you. I think, the U.S. moved a number of its Patriot missile batteries as well as its THAAD missile batteries from South Korea to they just broadly said to the Middle East. They didn't really specify where or what these were for. But I think this has really opened up the question of what the political purpose of the alliance is, and I think it has exposed it in a way that makes it very difficult to deny that the US presence in Korea is about anything other than Washington's own geopolitical interests. Because, the US loves to frame its alliance in humanitarian terms, in terms of friendship, right? Um, I don't know if folks have had the chance to visit US bases in Korea, but a very cringe slogan that they use is 같이 갑시다, which means let's go together, which is the kind of thing that you would say, to your buddy. There's a lot of videos of US commanders saying this in really bad Korean in an attempt to kind of ingratiate themselves to local population. But I think that, a friend does not leave you high and dry. A friend does not, take over land in your country and abuse people in that country and then go running off in order to do the same somewhere else, right? And I think that this episode has really demonstrated that. The question that I think arises is what's going to be done politically by organizations in South Korea in order to really push for the need for South Korea to have more independence in its foreign policy, in its military policy as well, and what's the level of clarity and boldness that the South Korean government will have as well, right? Because I think that these remarks on Twitter and these criticisms, they're welcome changes. But South Korea has material investments in Zionism. South Korea has arms partnerships with Israel, right? South Korea also, like often allows the U.S. to set the pace in terms of how things are going to go in the Korean Peninsula, in terms of how things are going to go with issues like U.S. operational control of the South Korean military. And so I think, there is this additional question of what's going to be done subjectively. How are people going to actually take advantage of the fact that they have free will in order to change conditions on the ground?
Could I say just maybe one thing? So like obviously I think yeah, I'm just learning a lot listening, but I think one thing that I find maybe, and I'm curious maybe what others think, or if we would shift to another question after this, but there's a question of like the underlying structure of world order or regional order and how that's undergoing a shift right now and what spaces that opens up. So like there was I think the United States just announced, or it has been announced that there's been a delay in the delivery of Tomahawk missiles to Japan due to the munitions crisis that has deepened from the war with Iran. So and so what you think about is like, okay, so whether they're the Gulf, the GCC states, or South Korea that move in a way they're comprador, they're integrated into U.S. capital circuits, etc. But the underlying power through which the United States is able to buttress and support those classes is eroding over time. So like how if the United States is able to establish its interest in order on the basis of a hard power that is eroding now. So what I will say, I think what I want to put on the table is the U.S. has lost to China. Like the economic game it's lost, but it's very clearly militarily, it is in no position actually to take on China anymore. Like whatever we would have saw before, but the crisis they're going to have replenishing their core munitions after this war, there's not going to be a crisis in fighting Iran, but in projecting power vis-a-vis China, that game is up. So what does that mean structurally for the balance of forces in the region that Korea is in East Asia and beyond? Like, how does that open political space, I guess, is the question, right? Because the United States can't really backstop the people it's supporting, maybe in a short term, but over a longer term. I think that's something that is going to have to be grappled with, right? It can't even provide public goods anymore. Like it can't even say to its clients, like in South Korea, that hey, we can assure you oil flows. So all it can now turn into is like a mafia boss that says, if you don't listen to us, we'll hurt you. Like that's kind of like the appeal that is there. And so the sense that seems to be made would be for like even a South Korea or the Gulf states to leave the US and integrate into even for their own class interests, but we're not really seeing that, right? So there's this contradiction at play there.
Just on that, Vikram, there's a question specific to you. You mentioned that the DPRK helped Iran with developing their missile systems. Could you and also the other panelists expand on this and the potential of future DPRK military support to Iran? And then I'd like to invite the other panelists to address this question of the role of people in the imperial core in supporting anti-imperialist struggles around the world.
The question, and maybe others on the other panelists can answer it better, but the question of the history of DPRK Islamic Republic relations is a complicated one to sift through if you start looking through it, because there's a lot of propaganda that's like, or I don't know propaganda, but like US ideological work that wants to magnify the DPRK Islamic Republic tie-up, right? They'll try to find, and they'll actually try to minimize Iran's own endogenous missile production capabilities to say it was North Korea that's giving them everything, it's China that's giving them everything. But there is evidence that in the 1980s, the DPRK played a really indispensable role actually, in the Islamic Republic being able to not only withstand, but to project power vis-a-vis the invasion of Iraq, which was supported by every major power in the world. It was really Iran alone, and then the DPRK and China. But what I want to say is one thing the DPRK really did that was essential, and that Iran takes this model and applies it to the Axis. And it's interesting because Betsy's question around George Jackson, the Black Panthers said each one teach one. And I think like the DPRK not only transferred arms, but had a knowledge diffusion component, right? Like a military and technical cooperation through which the capabilities for missile production, not just producing missiles, but how do you preserve your military reproduction capability by storing your production and engaging in production in places that US bombs cannot penetrate, right? So that's something that Korea learned, the DPRK learned in the war from the 1950s and onwards, right? And so those are sorts of things. This is like anti-imperialism at its purest expression, that kind of solidarity across. So, and I think, you do have evidence that that continued into the 1990s and onwards. It's difficult to sift through that, I think, but, you had delegations from the Islamic Republic going to North Korea and observing, I think, their military kind of launches and so forth. But I think they themselves also keep that kind of under wraps for obvious, I think, reasons. So, but I think that's a very significant. Maybe last point just on that is, I don't know much tactically when people are thinking, what can people do? What can movements do? But the one thing that I think people should lose their fear on and have clarity on is that the Islamic Republic right now is fighting a war for the entire world, right? This is not something that people should be shy about. There's so much at stake in the victory of the Islamic Republic over the United States, over the whole entire imperialist system. It will have system-wide implications, and the DPRK also has functioned as an anchor for anti-imperialism in this way that I think panelists would know better than me and people in the room would know better than me. But I think, the villains of the world system, the DPRK and the Islamic Republic, are in fact at the front lines of fighting against imperialism.
I may add to that. I think there was also a report about actually in 2025 after 12-day war, North Korean technical support was crucial in helping Iran's kind of rebuild its ballistic missile infrastructure and also underground facility. But I'm not sure that can be confirmed, but there are reports I recall reading. To me, the most important, interesting part of it is that, in a way, paradoxically, North Korea serves as alternative and also almost like example about how to deal with the United States. North Korea basically, did not submit to U.S. demands, and it developed nuclear weapons. And whereas Iran took the opposite path. So I think North Korea offers very symbolically and also in a realistic example what Iran might do or should do. Offer a alternative path. So in this sense, I think that there are some interesting relationships, and also theoretically too. And also, I think North Korea, not only for Iran, North Korea has, if you look at its history of all this post-war, the post-war history showed North Korea has to develop very sustained, close relationship with the many countries that fought against imperialism, from Africa to Cuba to all over the world. I think Iran is certainly, part of it.
Wondering, Basma?
Yeah. I was going to respond to the second part of your question, which was the role that we all have in the imperial core and really around the world. As we were saying, this is a war that's existential and also going to impact all of us and has been. The truth is that the genocide in Gaza has impacted all of us because it has set a new precedent of impunity and a new way of enacting brutality. I think as you were describing it, Bikram, like the United States has become this like mafia of like bullying, and that's all that it has to offer, and that's true, right? Like we see that in the ways that genocide has perpetuated and become incredibly brutal, and being at the cost of human life, being the only show of force or power that exists. And so what we all have an obligation to do is part of what Juhyun was also sharing, which is that, to find an organization, to participate in campaigns. There is so much work that is happening around multiple organizations and multiple movements for national liberation as an anti-war movement and an anti-imperialist movement, that there is room for everybody to participate in, whether it's students who were forming encampments, whether it is folks within the working class through their labor unions, or even like people who come from places that are upholding national liberation struggles, to participate in that work, to also learn from one another and work together. This is part of our duty and responsibility. And the truth is, like Bikram, you were mentioning repression. Sometimes repression is not something that we get to choose, right? So like, I imagine a lot of people in the encampments knew that there was risks in the actions that they were taking. But also we have communities here facing repression at all times without choice. That includes, for example, facing ICE agents in the United States at this moment. This like perpetuation of ICE around the country that is abducting people from their homes. That is not something that people have done anything in order to like invite repression necessarily in the same way, or knew that there was something that they were doing that could pose a greater risk. They were just existing within a land and a place and are now facing it. So a part of it is for us to also understand that in the same way that the US brutality is going from funding its Zionist war dog to commit genocide, to expanding into a war with Iran, putting Korea at risk, putting the Philippines putting the world at risk of what could be, harm in confronting imperialism, it applies to everybody who lives in the imperial core as well, of what it means for repression to come back. And what it means for the impacts of the violence of US empire to come back to the US or to the Western world in that way. And part of it is for us to recognize that if we do not start to organize, if we do not start to come together as communities and take steps towards building for ourselves a movement that rises above and beyond, that holds values that get to be established in antithesis to imperialism, we are still going to be subject to it regardless. And so I really invite everyone here to find an organization or to start to seek what are the national liberation struggles that are active in your region, in your neighborhood. There are so many campaigns out there, from arms embargo to, like confronting US imperialism in different lands, that we can band together and work together to fight against.
Yeah, I just want to, fully endorse what Basma just shared with all of us, because really the question of how we in the US or in the imperial core are going to lend a hand of solidarity to others has to begin with the question of capacity, right? We need real movements in these countries. We need real organizations that are capable of leading this kind of political fight. I think that's the task that's actually most immediately ahead of us. Given the fact that we're not just fighting for the liberation of other people. We're talking about our lives too, right? Like, what does this system really have to offer any of us? It's destroying our planet, right? For most of us, we don't have many prospects in the sense of escaping debt, being able to have consistent healthcare, like leading any kind of, quality of life under, what we have currently. And add on top of the fact that, the people ruling us are some of the most evil people that we can possibly conceive of, right? We've gotten to a point where like they are waging war on Venezuela, they're committing genocide in Palestine, they are, bombing Iran, they are practicing all these war games all around the world. It's a post-Epstein world, so we actually know a lot more about them and what they do behind closed doors than we ever did before as well. And so I think that, like we really have to bring this back to the question of like, what are we going to do and what is our political future going to be? And it doesn't have to begin with convincing the people around us necessarily. I think it has to begin with joining with others who share a common vision and being willing to engage in a collective process to build organizations, to build struggle, because that's how consciousness will be transformed, and that's also how historical conditions will be transformed too. So find an organization, please.
100%. Okay, we are coming to the end of time, so I'm going to ask one closing question, and maybe the panelists can give your remarks. Maybe we can go in the same order, Bikram, Simone, Basma, and Chuhyun. But, just simply, what do you think is coming next in terms of, how countries and people will respond? How do you think they should respond? And how do we build that organizational and movement capacity?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the question of what's coming next is it's a big question because I think like right now, just like suppose in Iran right now, we have the United States trying to enact a blockade that it's not able to enact. So I think what there's a phrase that we can say is that Hormuz is showing the truth of the world, right? Like it's showing this reality that Iran cannot be dislodged. Iran's sovereign capacity is beyond the reach of imperialism. That's a game changer, right? That's full stop happened. The United States doesn't have the capability to do that, and this blockade is being breached. So the I think like this question that has been pivotal to the U.S. order is that it is the power that through which you have to go through by holding U.S. dollars, by submitting to U.S. military power to access the core commodity of the world economy, which is oil. That is the time is clearly coming up for that, right? Now the United States may end up back at war with the Islamic Republic very soon. But I think the point that I think is going to be really challenging, or not challenging, I don't know how to frame this, but the costs are going to increasingly come home to bear for us. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. Like Hormuz is showing the truth, right? So we organize around anti-imperialism, but Hormuz is anti-imperialist power put into practice. Why should it be the case that we are spectators to what is happening in West Asia? How does so that is actually now as we rightfully should find organizations and become more organized. But the forces on the ground that are actually putting imperialism to question right now are the forces that we have been afraid to align with, right? Like the forces of it's been easy to say I'm with the Palestinians, right? It's not so easy, of course, there are costs, but to say free Palestine is one thing, right? But to move beyond the criminalization of those who materially contest imperialism in the region, who have taken it kind of by the throat now and are saying, now we will impose a cost on the entire world economy. So we are going to experience, and we all know this, inflation is coming in a way that we haven't quite maybe known it before, right? We're going to probably re-enter into the context of the 1970s, this economic phenomenon known as stagflation. We have inflation and economic stagnation coming at the same time. So the next few months, it's kind of already irreversible what's happened. So this is coming. The United States will not defeat Iran. That's not going to happen. They're not going to dislodge them from Hormuz. And insofar as like Ji-Yoon, you were saying, like they are only seeking surrender, and Iran will respond by only raising the costs to the world economy. It does pose a question of how we will respond. That will raise the costs for people across the board in the core. Yeah, I think I'll leave it to others to answer more. But the question is what sort of organized power will be in place, I think, to respond to the acute, I think, crises that will be felt here in the coming months.
I guess for myself as a Korean, I just wanted to say that for the last 4 years or so in the previous regime in Seoul, I felt a lot of Koreans felt that it was the most horrible experience. And on the day in Seoul was inaugurated, we started organizing. We, candlelight protested every day, every week, every month. So it turned out dreams can come true. So in that sense, I'm pretty actually quite hopeful and positive. Imperialism is kind of sustains on the kind of illusion that it creates. It's so powerful, can't be defeated. But I think the history showed that this, it can be defeated. And I think that our resistance has to be based on concrete material condition as well. You can't just have slogan. It has to workers, especially lesson that we learn from Korea's experience is that the power of unity, power of working class, the power of labor solidarity that gives us a sustained organization discipline. We need that. I think, which something like to me in the United States. Um, I think that the last thing that I said, despite all of this, I'm hopeful. Is that three things that I learned from the past few years of the Korean resistance for our democracy. Have a hope and have a courage. And if you don't have any of those, have a faith, and it's going to happen, and we can do it.
Um, I think I definitely echo that on the question of what is going to happen, there's a lot of unknowns still and a lot of different kinds of possibilities. And I think that the truth is that, yes, there is a lot for us to withstand. In terms of, the cost of what is about to come to the imperial core, and also for a lot of us, the truth is like the cost of the loss of land, the loss of family, the loss of friends, the loss of community. And this is something that has been going on and will continue to go on. And part of what I think is important about organizing and being in a community that is organized is to create these systems to be able to withstand together and create also, like as Simone was saying, the avenues of hope, right? And I think of that as like avenues also of conviction of what it is to truly believe in a national liberation struggle. There is a lot of demands that are going to come to us as people across the planet to have to withstand. And actually, like, what is it that it looks like to recognize that what we are withstanding is a fight against imperialism? And so when we have our convictions that are anti-imperialist, when we are like truly profoundly believe in that, what do we do actually to continue to work towards supporting in whatever means possible national liberation struggles and imperialism, right? So and like fighting imperialism. And sometimes that looks like starting with attending webinars and getting information and learning and growing and sharing that with other people. Other times it looks like participating in campaigns or joining an organization. But the truth is that like sometimes it also looks like community support, right? There's so many different ways in which we have to start to find an alternative to sustain whatever is to come and whatever is going to continue to come, because there is a conviction that actually the fight against imperialism is necessary, because even though it is going to be hard and there is endurance that is required, what is to come is so valuable and so worthy. And like we have seen that across space and time, but especially in Gaza, right? The loss of life, the martyrs, hundreds of thousands of people who have sacrificed in order to achieve national liberation, to resist occupation. These are important values for us to hold, the lives that have been lost. And so how do we get to make sure that these are the values that we continue to hold, the convictions that we hold, to endure whatever is to come? That might be unpredictable because there is irrational actors that are behaving in ways that might not make sense. And the truth is that it's impacting everybody across the planet now.
Yeah, I won't belabor the point any more than I think, our amazing panelists have already done. But, I think I would just add, we don't know what's going to come, and the only way to really prepare is collectively, right? We're not going to have individual solutions to the crisis that's about to hit the world. You're never going to stock enough beans by yourself to be able to deal with what's coming, right? You need to turn to the collective solutions and look for the power around you and people around you, right? We know that inflation is coming. We know that it's very likely that there will be huge impacts on fuel, on agriculture. We'll feel the downstream effects of that for years, right? And the response of the ruling class will be to try to convince us that we need to give up our daily necessities in order for them to have profits, right? We could look at situations where they're saying things like, well, we can't, power your kid's school because we need to, divert that energy to the Amazon data center. or things along those lines, right? And your community needs to be ready to fight back against that, right? I think that's what we need to be preparing to do in this moment, right? It's not a time for panic, right? What's coming is going to come. We're not able to change it. But what we are able to change is our level of preparedness that begins with our level of organization, our relations to one another, right? And our ability to be able to really identify when and how to fight back and win. And that's really what it's going to take, right? Because it's not about the near term objectives of, this or that policy outcome. We're fighting for liberation, and liberation is a lifelong struggle, right? So I would say that, this is a time for us to really redouble that commitment, to look for new ways to engage in and expand that fight, and to really just remember that we can do it, right? Because we have to do it. We're the only ones who will be able to. And in the end, we do outnumber the ruling class, and all of their wealth and power actually comes from us, right? We just have to have the consciousness to be able to realize that and organize it for something positive rather than for something destructive.
And on that note, thank you so much, everyone. Special shout outs to our amazing panelists for this incredibly clarifying and uplifting conversation we had today. Shout outs to also the Luthor members, Winter and Teo, who did a lot of the behind the scenes work. We've throughout the um, webinar dropped links from the speakers as well as additional resources. We are going to share that with you after the webinar. But words that I'm hearing today are, especially in this last round, are things like, the political conviction that we need, endurance, and of course, resistance and revolution. So I hope for everyone who's joined us today, these words stay with you, move you, challenge you, and really we're echoing what Basma has said around joining organization, building cross-movement and cross-sectoral unity, and really clarifying the struggle as we as we continue the fight for liberation. So thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you at our next webinar. Please continue to follow the work and the organizing of our speakers today.